Firstly, I want to acknowledge we're on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and I'm here to comment today on the federal government's decision to proceed with the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Although I'm disappointed with the decision, I had a conversation with the Prime Minister this morning, and I reiterated our concerns about the consequences of a catastrophic marine spill and the impact that would have on not just our marine environment, but our economy here in British Columbia. However, I also reiterated that from the beginning, my government has taken a consistent and balanced approach, constantly respectful of the rule of law. Firstly, we joined in a pre-existing legal case, what was known as then the Tsleil-Waututh case, which you will know is the reason we had a reassessment of the Indigenous consultation component of the National Energy Board process. The court found in favor of the Tsleil-Waututh, and we've had over the past number of months discussions going forward between the federal government, the Tsleil-Waututh and other Indigenous peoples, as well as what I would characterize as an abridged review of the consequences of a marine spill. The first National Energy Board process did not, I repeat, did not take into consideration the consequences of a 7-fold increase in tanker traffic from here through the Salish Sea and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The potential consequences to our marine environment were serious. We made that case. We continue to make that case. When questions were raised about our jurisdiction and our ability to manage substances coming in and out of British Columbia, we did what I believe was the reasonable thing. We asked the federal government to join with us and refer the matter to the Supreme Court of Canada. At that time, the federal government declined, and we went to the Court of Appeal here. Although we were unsuccessful in our appeal, we have made application to go directly to the Supreme Court, and I believe that's what British Columbians would want us to do. This is not just about this project, it's about protecting provincial jurisdiction and ensuring that the government of British Columbia can do everything in its power to protect those things that are so important to British Columbians. While we have entered into court actions, we have been responsibly issuing permits as they've been requested, doing our due diligence, and George will speak to that briefly, but doing what we can to ensure that we're protecting the public interest while not obstructing duly approved projects. We've stood principally to protect those things that matter to not just British Columbians, but in fact all Canadians. We'll continue to do that. I believe it's my job as the Premier of British Columbia to always be vigilant to protect those things that matter to British Columbians, and I'll continue to do that. Although I regret the federal government's decision, it is within their authority to make that decision. It's now up to George and I and the Government of British Columbia to make sure as this project proceeds, we have no impacts on our marine life, we have no impact on our natural environment, and we do not put at risk one of the hottest economies in the country, an economy that's working for all British Columbians, not just a select few. Thanks very much, and I'll have George say a few things.
Thank you, Premier. Good afternoon, everyone. Our government continues to maintain that the TMX project poses very significant risks to our environment, to our coast, and to our economy. And we continue to assert that there are potentially catastrophic consequences of a diluted bitumen spill. Tens of thousands of British Columbians' jobs are at risk, and billions of dollars of economic activity are also at risk. Today's decision was the federal government's decision to make, and that's never been in question. We also note that a number of Indigenous governments have raised the possibility of new legal challenges to the federal government's second approval of this project. That will be their decision to make. But we know that British Columbians continue to be deeply concerned over a 7-fold increase in tanker traffic in the Salish Sea. They are deeply concerned about the consequences of a catastrophic oil spill to our environment and to the jobs and economic benefits for British Columbians that depend on the marine environment. So let me say to British Columbians who value our environment, who cherish our coast, who expect their government to stand up for their interests, we will not abandon our responsibility to protect our land and our water. We'll continue to stand up and defend our environment, our coast, and the tens of thousands of jobs that are dependent on them. Thank you very much. We'd be happy to take questions.
All right, my colleague Shruti has a microphone there, as there are folks on the phone. If you could raise your hand if you have a question here. We'll start with questions on location, and then we will go to those from the phone. Any questions here? No questions.
Was that succinct?
Here. Wow.
Right to the point. Oh, there we go.
We've got one here.
Well, as I said, we're going to continue with our reference case to the Supreme Court. This is a matter of orders of government determining where jurisdiction rests when it comes to environment issues. That's part and parcel of our plan. It has been our plan from the beginning. I did say, and George will reiterate, that as we issue permits, should the permits be lawfully sought, should the permits not be contravening any of the conditions that have been put in place by either the National Energy Board or the federal government, we will proceed in an appropriate manner. But should there be permits that don't fit into that category, we have every right and responsibility to ensure that we're protecting the public interest, and we'll continue to do that.
Okay, we have another.
Sorry, follow up. Wow. If First Nations announced today that they are going to be filing lawsuits, or if they decide to file more lawsuits in the future, will you join them?
We'll have to see what the substance of their applications are. Again, what we've tried to do from the beginning, we campaigned on the notion that this project was not in our interest here in British Columbia. We continue to hold that view. But we also understand and respect the rule of law. If the federal government sees themselves back in court, whether it's the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, or others, we'll certainly take a good hard look at that. And if it's in the interest of British Columbia to join them, we will.
Okay, we have a question from the Star.
Premier Horgan, what do you have to say to the decision to approve the Trans Mountain Pipeline coming right after they acknowledged a climate emergency last night?
Well, I know George will want to say something about that, but it does ring somewhat hollow that on one day you can claim that there's an emergency, and on another day you can accelerate the increase of emissions in Canada. These are challenging times, so we have a very robust climate action plan here, Clean BC. We worked on it together, George and our team and the Green Caucus, passed by the legislature, fitting in the largest private sector investment, a liquefied natural gas plant, fit into a plan to reduce emissions by 2030, reduce emissions further by 2040, and ultimately meeting our requirements by 2050. So I believe you can walk and chew gum at the same time. It is odd to have a resolution, a symbolic resolution one day in the House of Commons, and then a definitive statement the next day that could have catastrophic consequences, not just for our marine environment, but also for climate action. I think George probably wants to say something on that.
I think even by the federal government's previous calculus, despite our significant concern for our coast, they at least claimed that they had agreed with the Alberta government of the time on a cap on oil sands production as well as a carbon tax. Both those measures are now disavowed by the current Alberta government. So we believe that the best way to deal with a climate emergency is not to declare one, but to have a clear climate action plan to address it. That's what we have in BC. That's what we need in Canada.
Right on.
And Frank.
Premier, there has been supporters all along the way, and of course today after the decision is made, several unions and the business groups, and of course some indigenous communities are also expressing their support to the project. So what are you going to say to those people on your position of exhaust all the avenues to stop this?
Well, I say to those people that they know full well this has been a divisive issue, not just for the time of our government, some 23 months today since we were sworn in, but it was a divisive issue well before the last election, and in fact, the one before that. So this is no surprise to the business community, to labor unions, to Indigenous groups, to people sitting in coffee shops today here in Vancouver or throughout British Columbia. This is an issue that's divided communities, it's divided families. I'm not oblivious to that. My responsibility, however, is to look at what is the consequence of a catastrophic event as a result of this decision. And I think even those who support the pipeline would want me to continue to fight hard to make sure that the marine response plan of the federal government is adequate to meet the needs of a catastrophic spill. We've identified gaps in the ocean protection plan. We've raised those with the federal government. We'll continue to do that. But that's not in the context of this project. It's in the context of what's the right thing for the government of BC to do. And I think there's unanimous support for making sure that we are prepared for a terrible event. The best thing we can do is make sure that the federal government steps up and does what they said they will do, and we will be then in a position to fill those gaps if need be. But it's the federal government's project. It's the federal government that's responsible for our marine environment. If they're not prepared to protect it, we certainly will. But the best way forward is for us to continue to work hard. I raised it again with the Prime Minister today. I got assurances from him that the commitment from the federal government remains firm. I say you need to double down on that. We'll see how that goes in the months ahead.
We're going to take some questions from the phone now.
Justine Hunter, Globe and Mail, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, that doesn't sound like Justine Hunter at all. That does. Hi.
Hi. So can you, as a government, approve a permit to tunnel under, say, the Fraser River if you still see gaps in the marine response regime in this plan here?
Well, again, Justine, what I said and what we'll commit to do is ensure that as permits are requested, we do the due diligence we would do for any project, whether it's a publicly funded capital project, whether it's a private sector initiative, whether it's a community seeking approval to make changes to their official community plan. Those are always looked at with diligence in the interest of protecting the public. We'll continue to do that, whether it's Kinder Morgan or, a Trans Mountain application or an application from any other citizen or group.
Just to follow up, the BC Greens asked in the legislature last fall for BC to declare a climate emergency. Do you think there is a climate emergency that we're in right now?
Well, I would just reiterate what George said. In fact, maybe he might want to say it again. The best course of action for governments is to not declare there's a problem, but to take steps to resolve the problem. We believe that climate change and global warming are a significant threat to the well-being of the people of British Columbia and, in fact, the world. And that's why we put in place a plan, Clean BC, last fall, working with the Green Party, working with other stakeholders in the community, the business community, Indigenous people, environmental organizations. And we have a really solid plan that took a lot of time to develop. I believe the public would prefer to see action rather than statements and pronouncements from politicians in legislatures or city halls or in the town square, quite frankly. If there's a problem, take action. That's what we're doing on climate change.
Thank you.
Richard Sussman, Globe and News, please go ahead. Premier, will you allow members of your caucus or cabinet to participate in protests against the Trans Mountain Pipeline?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about that since the decision today, but I did make it pretty clear to my colleagues that you take on a different responsibility when you put your name forward for election. When you're successful, you're not just representing the party that you ran for, you're representing the entire community. And if you want to be on the vanguard of a protest line, best that you devote all your energy to that. If you want to resolve the challenges of our time, you put your name forward, you've been elected to Parliament or to a legislature or to a city council, far better to put your shoulder to the wheel and solve problems for people. Encouraging them to exercise their right to protest, absolutely, but to focus on your key responsibility, which is to be a representative for all people, even those that disagree with you.
The Prime Minister announced today putting money back into solving this issue, as well as working closely with First Nations, potentially to see them holding 100% ownership stake in the project.
Yeah, the Prime Minister did tell me about that. He said it would be from profits from the venture. Again, I see a significant outlay of capital to purchase the existing pipe. I see a significant amount of money to lay the twinning of the pipe, and I've not seen any confirmed markets. So the notion that there will be profits to distribute to Indigenous peoples or to communities or to address climate action is not yet real for me. But obviously the government needs to be aspirational about these things. But to suggest that in 2025 there'll be a profit from this that could go to some other activity is far beyond my time horizon, and I'll leave that to people in 2025 to debate.
Thanks, Premier.
Do we have any further questions? All right. Thank you.
Canucks should take a right-handed defenseman with the first pick. There you go.